France was impoverished. On the streets of Paris, mothers fed their children with pieces of bread crusts. Men stood in lines for soup, and rumors about a new outbreak of famine spread across the country. But behind the golden gates of Versailles, the reality was completely different. King Louis X did not only live in debauchery, he built a private brothel for himself right inside the royal palace. Servants called it the Parc des Cyrils. There were no decorations, no carpets, and no paintings, only narrow corridors, hidden doors, and rooms where virgins were turned into the king's playthings. Girls were brought from every part of France. Some believed the promises of work at the palace, some were sold by their parents for a piece of bread, and some were kidnapped. Their youth cost the crown less than one glass of wine at the royal table. Doctors examined each of them. There were purity tests, cold medical inspections, and written certificates saying that the girl's body was suitable for the king. These papers were kept like military documents. Today historians find fragments of those lists, names crossed out with pencil. For Louis, they were not people but numbers in a secret file. And while the country starved, every night in Cyrils turned into a feast. Masks, costumes, orgies, laughter, and screams that drowned the music. All this was paid from the French treasury. That was the place where what later would be called the moral collapse of the monarchy began. He had to be the symbol of Bourbon greatness. Louis X, the beloved king, heir of his father King Louis I. France expected him to shine and to win victories, but very soon his title, the Beloved, hid not admiration but ridicule. By the middle of the 15th century, the king lost interest in ruling the country. Ministers argued among themselves, Parliament rejected any reforms, and the people complained louder and louder. France was in a financial crisis. The treasury was empty after endless wars. Bread prices were rising, and thousands of people were starving. But Louis did not look for help in politics. His salvation was women. Not one, not two dozens, hundreds. Earlier he was satisfied with favorites like the Marquise de Pompadour and later Madame du Barry. But even this became not enough. The king did not want simple mistresses, he wanted a system. Not short romances, but a place where pleasure was under rules and control. Thus appeared a project that people tried not to mention even in their memoirs. Servants called it Parc aux Cerfs, remembering the harems of the East. It was not Versailles of gold and mirrors, but a dark corridor inside the palace that led to small rooms. Why did the king need a brothel? Not only for lust. It was his way to prove to himself that he was still strong, still powerful, still master of destinies. While France sank into poverty, Louis X built his own den, a symbol of power, perverse and humiliating. Parc aux Cerfs was like a tumor inside Versailles. The greatest palace of Europe, with its marble halls and mirrored galleries, hid a dirty secret under its beauty. Behind doors that were not on any architect's plan, a narrow, damp corridor began, dimly lit by torches. There was no gold and no portraits. Darkness ruled, and the smell of wine, tobacco, and sweat filled the air. The rooms were small. Each had a bed, a screen, several candles, and a jug of water. There was no decoration, only bare walls. There was no reason to remind anyone about France's glory, because it was not a king who entered, but a man to whom everything was permitted. The entrance to Parc aux Cerfs was guarded not by ordinary guards, but by Louis's trusted officers. They knew exactly who was allowed to enter and who was not. People said that the king had a whole system of signals. A candle placed in a window or a mark in the corridor meant that the girls were being prepared that night. Sometimes the Cyrils was disguised as a guest room. Courtiers saw girls in modest dresses climbing the stairs, but no one dared to ask questions. Those who tried to uncover the truth disappeared from Versailles as quickly as they had come. It was not a place for random witnesses. Only a few people knew about its existence, and among them were not only the king's companions but also his enemies, who were gathering proof to accuse Louis X of debauchery, the like of which Europe had never known. They appeared suddenly. Simple peasant girls, barely past the first signs of womanhood, vanished from villages and towns. Parents said that their daughter had gone to Paris to serve at the royal palace. It sounded like a dream. Who would refuse when the king's men came knocking at the door? But the reality was far darker. Louis X had his own agents for recruitment. They were called the Royal Hunters. They moved through the country, searching for young and innocent girls, persuading families that their daughter would serve as a lady-in-waiting. Sometimes they gave money, a small purse, a coin meant for a lifetime, and sometimes they threatened, refuse and you will be considered an enemy of the crown. There were also those who were simply abducted. Historians have found references in city chronicles. A shoemaker's daughter vanished, seen taken away by men in livery. The parents cried out, but their screams were silenced by fear, for these men acted in the king's name. The girls were secretly transported to Paris, not in carriages with the Bourbon emblem, but in closed wagons like animals. Rumors spread that there was a secret back entrance near the gates of Versailles, through which they were brought in at night so that courtiers would not see. Partial lists of names have survived. In the archives, there are pages with notes. Admitted, rejected, sent to doctor. Pencil marks, erased names, the faint shadows of real lives. These fragments of paper are all that remain of the girls who were turned into living property. For Louis X, they were not people but material. Each new arrival was proof that the king was still young, still strong, still capable of proving his right to rule. Their bodies became tools for his personal and political illusions. For Louis X, women were no longer only for pleasure. His secret brothel turned into a stage where not only the king and his circle found amusement, but where the destinies of courtiers, diplomats, and enemies of the crown were decided. Versailles was made of intrigues. Every move of a courtier was watched by hundreds of envious eyes. In such a world, even a small piece of evidence could become a weapon. Louis X understood this. He was not a strategist like his great-grandfather Louis I, but he knew how to exploit human weakness, and Parc aux Cerfs became a perfect place for these games. Rumors said that powerful nobles and foreign ambassadors were sometimes invited there. One night with a young girl could turn into a trap. Behind a screen, a servant stood with a notebook, recording names, manners, and words spoken in drunken confusion. By morning, these notes reached the king's confidants. Some contemporaries claimed that Louis himself lured his enemies into those rooms. First came wine, a rich dinner, the promise of secret pleasure, and then, a girl too young to justify her presence. And suddenly an important man found himself in a situation from which there was no clean escape. These episodes were rarely recorded, but traces remain. In the correspondence of one minister there was a complaint. The king keeps us on a leash because he knows too much about our night at Versailles. Another letter, discovered centuries later, mentioned a room where seduction served as a seal. Historians still argue whether it was an organized system or merely a spontaneous amusement. But one thing is clear, in Cyrils there were not only moans and laughter. The silence of blackmail was born there. For Louis it became a double poison. He not only fulfilled his desires but also strengthened his illusion of power. Every enemy and every advisor were in his hands, just like the girls brought into those hidden rooms. But this game turned against him. The deeper the king sank into his world of vice, the less he understood the real France. He saw it only through the curtains of Cyrils and believed that everything was still under his control. While famine was already spreading across the provinces and through the streets of Paris, hatred was growing toward the man who kept the nation in bed. In the Sorel Park, the night began not with prayers or with the music of the royal orchestra, but with a loud knock on the door. The girls were led down the corridor. Torches threw uneven shadows on the stone walls. The air was heavy with smoke, cheap wine, and incense, lit intentionally to hide the odor of sweat. The rooms came alive with sound. Laughter echoed here and there, muffled cries from another side. Servants carried in wine, fruits, and dishes melting from the heat while the guests did not even glance at them. The main attraction was not the tables, it was the bodies. The girls were dressed in masks, sometimes as shepherdesses, sometimes as nymphs or goddesses. Some wore veils over their faces to cover the fear in their eyes. The masks turned them into nameless figures, fantasies to be used and forgotten. The orgies began with light laughter. The king could sit in a chair, holding a glass of wine, watching the men of his circle perform their shows. Sometimes Louis himself took part in the game, but more often he simply enjoyed watching, enjoying the power he possessed. He could raise a finger and a girl would be brought to him like a trophy. Witnesses wrote that all of this took place in the light of dozens of candles. The flames flickered, reflecting on bare bodies, turning them into living statues. Music drifted from the next room, quiet and slow, like the background of a silent play. But behind this splendor hid cruelty. The girls were never asked what they wanted. Tears did not stop the performance. On the contrary, they were seen as part of the show. The Sorel was a theater where no one performed willingly. Sometimes knights turned the place into masquerades. Courtiers dressed as ancient gods, and scenes from old legends were played again. But instead of a drama about Hercules or Venus, there unfolded a play about power and humiliation. Every movement, every cry remained in the memories of those who later whispered about what happened in the corridors of Versailles. The sounds of Sorel escaped outside. Those walking through the palace halls at night heard voices and laughter muffled by the walls. These rumors soon became more detailed. Some said they had seen the king himself, wearing the mask of a satirical god. Others claimed that once a tragedy had been performed in those chambers, with real girls as actors. Each such night strengthened the image of Louis X as a libertine, a man lost in his fantasies, blind to his country. For France, it became a symbol of betrayal. The king enjoyed himself while his people died of hunger. Any secret, no matter how well guarded, sooner or later escapes the walls. The Sorel chambers had been created as a world of darkness, hidden from outside eyes. But at Versailles, nothing could remain hidden forever. The corridors filled with whispers, and the servants' ears were sharper than the swords of musketeers. Laughter was the first to leak out of the palace. People sleeping in nearby rooms heard noises that should not have existed in a royal residence. Moans, cries, songs, laughter. Some wrote about it in diaries, others in letters to friends. These letters survived. I heard laughter turn into crying in His Majesty's chambers, and those tears belonged not to a woman who came there of her own will. Soon the first pamphlets appeared. The Parisian streets buzzed with rumors. Traveling sellers offered cheap leaflets with caricatures of the king, a fat man in a crown, surrounded by children in masks. The captions were short and bitter. Beloved but not of France. Some texts were even more terrible. They wrote that inside the palace there existed a dark brothel where girls were brought from the countryside. And though the authorities hunted the writers and burned their messengers, the rumors spread faster than the fires could be put out. Historians later found evidence that the informers were not only the king's enemies, but also people within the palace. Secret notes from maids, scraps of paper with names, noticed by accident and passed to the opposition. One maid who worked in the Sorel corridors wrote in her diary, "They enter as children, leave in silence, and do not meet his eyes." These lines later became one of the strongest accusations against Louis X. Paris was buzzing. In coffeehouses, they spoke about the king's nightly pleasures. In taverns, people sang verses mocking the lustful monarch. The louder the talk, the faster the myth of the father king collapsed. Now he was called differently, the satyr king, the hunted king. But the biggest blow came from the so-called black notebooks. They supposedly contained names, dates, and descriptions of the visits. It was said that one of the royal physicians smuggled some of these records out of Versailles. The notebooks spread among private circles, feeding the hatred toward the monarch. Even if some of the entries were invented, they were believed as truth. The society wanted to believe the worst. The exposure could no longer be undone. The people no longer saw Louis X as a beloved ruler. They saw him as a man who exchanged his country for nights with girls. The French monarchy was breaking apart, and each new rumor was another hammer striking the already cracked wall. In the 15th century, monarchy was more than a form of power. The king was considered the father of the nation, the symbol of divine order, the one who held the bond between heaven and earth. Louis X was meant to be the guardian of this connection, but the more the stories of Parc de Sorel spread, the more clearly the very idea of a father king began to crumble. For the French, this was a personal betrayal. When peasants gave their last grain to the tax collectors, they believed it would go to the army, to the roads, or at least to a feast for the glory of France. But instead, that bread became wine for royal orgies. In the eyes of the people, it was sacrilege. France at that time had a unique pamphlet culture. Small leaflets that spread through the streets faster than news itself. And every new scandal about the sorrel appeared on those satirical pages. Louis X was drawn with long donkey ears, surrounded by girls not older than 12. Under the drawings they wrote, "Dearest, yes, but only to his own lusts." These caricatures even reached the distant provinces. Where people rarely saw the king himself, rumors about his debauchery became the only image of the monarch. For the poor, Versailles was no longer a golden symbol of glory, but a nest of sin. The contrast between the image of the father of the nation and the image of satyrs in a brothel was especially devastating. For Catholic France, this was a blow to the very heart of faith. How could one pray for the health of the king if, according to witnesses, he was buying virgins from his own people? But it was not only a moral question. The sorrel became a symbol of the growing gap between the elite and the common folk. At that time, bread riots were raging in the streets of Paris. Crowds were breaking into bakeries because the prices had tripled. Against this background, rumors that whole baskets of bread and wine were being wasted daily in Versailles seemed to confirm that the monarchy was feeding on the bones of the people. Even the aristocrats began to whisper. The ladies of the court wrote to each other with complaints. "We can no longer defend him. He is destroying our home." In the Paris Parliament, some deputies openly said that the king himself was ruining the respect for the throne. For the opposition, this became a priceless gift. Every disclosure, every leak strengthened their cause. When Enlightenment philosophers Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau wrote about the decay of the old regime, people imagined not abstract ideas but real scenes. Rooms without windows, humiliated girls, a king with a glass of wine. And the deeper Louis X withdrew into his sorrel, the less he saw the world collapsing around him. For him, it was an island of pleasure. For France, a symbol that power had finally rotted. This reputation passed through generations. Even Louis, his grandson, came to the throne under the shadow of his grandfather's shame. The people no longer believed the new promises. For them, all the Bourbons had become one and the same. Corrupt, cruel, indifferent to pain. And when, decades later, the guillotine fell upon the neck of the last king, its blades were sharpened not only by revolutionaries, but also by the ghosts of Louis X's knights. Thus, the royal brothel became not just a scandal but a historic crime against the very idea of monarchy. France lost its faith and with it, its throne. Louis X lived a long life for his age, but his death was not triumphant, not divine like that of the Sun King, and not worthy of legend. His end became a reflection of the decay he had created himself. In old age, the king turned into a shadow of who he once was. His strength faded, his health deteriorated, but his addiction to the sorrel remained. Even when his face was covered with wrinkles and his body weakened by illness, he continued to demand young girls. For him, they were no longer pleasure, they became medicine and addiction. He believed that purity could prolong his life, and the closer death came, the more desperately he clung to this illusion. Historians found notes that the last years of his reign were marked not by state councils, but by sorrel nights. Ministers waited for decisions on urgent matters, while the king sat in hidden chambers, surrounded by masks and candles. The court fell into paralysis. The country was sinking into catastrophe, but no amount of virgin flesh could stop the inevitable. In 1774, the king became ill. At first, it seemed to be only a mild fever, but doctors soon understood that it was something much worse. The 15th Louis was struck by smallpox, the same illness against which he had refused to vaccinate his own children and grandchildren. Symbolically, it became his final judgment. The disease spread quickly. The king's face was covered with sores. His body began to rot alive. The stench that filled his chambers was so terrible that the ladies of the court fainted when they entered his bedroom. His servants complained that they could not come near his bed without wrapping their faces in cloth. The doctors refused to approach him, afraid of infection. In those days it seemed as if fate itself was taking revenge on the king. He who had humiliated young girls for his own pleasure now found himself humiliated. His body became a spectacle of horror and disgust, and those who had recently knelt before him now kept away. The people, too, heard about the disease. Rumors spread through Paris faster than couriers. When the news of the king's death reached the capital, the streets did not sink into mourning. On the contrary, they filled with rejoicing. Crowds shouted, laughed, and raised their glasses. For them, the death of Louis X was not a tragedy but a release from disgrace. His title, the Beloved, turned into mockery forever. And so, when the king's corpse lay in Versailles, the stench of decay was so strong that it had to be taken away at night, almost in secret. No solemn procession, no royal splendor. The coffin was removed in haste, as though they wished to erase the memory itself. There was bitter symbolism in this ending. The man who had turned Versailles into a brothel died, as if France itself had turned away from him. His death became a reflection of the decay of monarchy. Yet the most terrible thing was not his body but what he left behind. For with Louis X died the people's faith in royal power. In the eyes of the nation, the Bourbons became the image of corruption, weakness, and betrayal. And when his grandson, Louis XVI, took the throne years later, he was already condemned. The people saw in him not a ruler but a continuation of a dynasty that had wasted its power on nights of lust and cries from hidden chambers. The French Revolution did not begin with Rousseau's pamphlet or the blow of Desmoulins. It began the moment the king himself destroyed the sacred aura of authority, when his throne was stained with the blood and tears of girls led through the corridors of the Parc du Ciel. When golden Versailles became a symbol of lust instead of glory, history remembered him that way. Not as a wise ruler, not as a commander, but as the man who built a brothel inside the palace and buried monarchy in his own bed. His life became a warning. Power that stops serving its people and turns into an instrument of personal vice inevitably decays. And the brighter the candle of pleasure burns, the sooner darkness falls.